A million years ago, it seems to me, I started making handmade paper in this very studio. I made jewelry, I made sculpture, and this was all before I moved downtown to my studio on High Street. Best known for our cow clocks, I sold the business in 2007. But before that, my husband and I enjoyed a good run with the handmade paper sculptures and clocks. They were sold in 600 galleries in the US and 14 foreign countries. Takes a lickin' and keeps on tickin' was our motto, and it took me a long, long way. These are some of the handmade paper sculptures that I made during those years, a few that have meant something to me and I kept. Here's one of a full figure that was one of the first full figure sculptures that I made. Another is of the dog clocks that, I even got to the point where I was making portrait dog clocks. In fact, one year I realized that I made over 600 golden retriever clocks. So yes, I'd had enough of all that. So in 2007, when we sold the business, I came back to the studio. And now, in another life, I paint and teach workshops with a few students. And since the pandemic, I find myself doing mostly critiquing online. I hope you all had a chance to see the Hopper show at Newfields. It was a wonderful show. And aside from wearing a mask throughout the whole show, it seemed almost normal again and was wonderful to feel like things are opening up. Hopper made it clear that great art is the outward expression of an inner life, and this inner life will result in a personal vision of the world. And in this fast-paced world, we as painters are all searchers. You and I, all of us in WSI, we want to make a painting that inscribes our personal signature, no matter how exactly we do it. I've found that at age 83, there's no state of vacuum. There's no condemnation to failure or hopeless impasse, no running out of time or closing of a vista. But the one thing we need to make sure that whatever we paint doesn't just say, this is my painting, but it says, this is me. Artists have been hard hit by the pandemic, but I feel at least one good thing has surfaced in the last 2 months. First of all, a lot of us had time to go back to the basics of art. I've made the most of having to stay home. Drawing and sketching in watercolor gave me ways to investigate the many ways of the medium. The lockdown made a real mockery of constraints. I did have time to paint, and so I did a lot of simple little object paintings. And of course, I looked at my fruit and I painted my fruit before it spoiled or I gobbled it up. I had a great time doing it on gouache, and it was a good exercise looking at the painting of the fruit and then going back and forth between that and my master paintings to get an old world feel to it. I wanted to spend some time talking about what I think painting is. Some 50 years ago or more, I was taught old school. Paint what you see, the instructor said, and then he disappeared, leaving us with a blank canvas and a lot of paint, and we had no idea what we were doing. But that was our school of the 50s. So when all else failed, I turned to art history for my inspiration. Here you see the School of Athens, one of my favorite old pieces from the Renaissance, done by Raphael. And in it appears Aristotle, and he himself said, painters don't paint just what they see, but they paint the significance of what they see. Eons later, Delacroix painted liberty leading the people. It seems so good for us to look at this right now because we are surrounded by the protest movement, and we are aware of the fact that way back 400 years ago, there was a protest movement too. But in Liberty Leading the People, Delacroix says to us, the first virtue of painting is that it is a feast for the soul and the eyes. Georgia O'Keeffe, in the 20th century, one of my very favorites, said lines and colors put together so they should say something. And she inspired me to do this painting that hangs over my fireplace now. And finally, from the IMA Newfield's recent show, Edward Hopper said, if you could say it in words, there would be no reason to paint. I really liked that from the show, and I thought how smart he was. Of course, if we could write it, we wouldn't have to paint it. And then, of course, Wolf Kahn, one of my very favorites, who paints wonderful, colorful paintings, shocking us with the colors that he puts into his pastels and his paintings. Our goal is not to be the world's slowest camera, and I want us all to take that to heart. So armed with these great quotes, and then pages from the Techniques of the World's Great Painters by Waldmar, that was the book I suggested that you all take a look at in the last WSI newsletter. Ideas start to mull around in my head, and they become like a stone in my shoe. So how does one get this stone to be a visual idea? All of us, no matter how experienced a painter, no matter where our career would take us or how well we do, we have to think about some of the following things before we put our brush to paper. One of my Bibles, of course, is this book called Design and Composition by Nathaniel Goldstein. He tells us that a painter's goal is the visual idea, which must be one that organizes and arranges space, value, line, shape, color, texture. All of us know those words. We've heard them a million times. But do we ever think about them before we start to put our brush to paper? Into a non-verbal statement, Nathaniel Goldstein says, creativity needs limitations and constraints. And then he tells us some of the things that a painting is not, which I find very interesting. One of the things a painting is not a symbol. It is not anecdotal. It is not an illustration. And it's not sentimental. So as I read through Goldstein's comments on what a painting was not, it got me to thinking, these are the traps that we all fall into. We care more about our rendering skills than actually what we're painting. We use the same brushes. We mix the same favorite colors. We apply them all in the same way. We use the same approaches to composition, not trying to think of a new composition. We use the same techniques. And of course, then we come to the same conclusions. It's a habit. And yet, when we look in that book of great paintings of the world, there are 1,000 different skills. And the compositions are used by the same master, all in different ways, always within structural limitations. This is where painting creativity thrives. Watercolor commands that one let go and experiment. Goldstein goes on further to tell us to consider these things before painting, that all good paintings have good bones. And when we talk about good bones, we talk about space structure. I want you to look at a chart that I have up in my studio. It's my good bones structure, and I refer to it often. There are 17 different structures to consider, and by each of these, I've listed the artists' names who have used these structures. Okay, look at this structure chart. On this chart, I not only have shown the 17 different structures, but I also have written down names of artists that paintings show those different structures. For instance, the grid structure, in which we see that often in, of course, Gerhard Richter's paintings or Klay's paintings. Chuck Close's paintings, Hoffman's, and also Stella's. The circle, we see in Matisse often using that, and Miro and Rubens uses the circle. The triangle, oh my goodness, the painters of the Renaissance were heavy into the triangle. Vermeer, Rembrandt, and in modern day, Wyeth and Manet and Da Vinci and El Greco, there are more people using the triangle. The diamond shape is, of course, one of Cézanne's favorites, and Velasquez and Van Gogh. The L shape with Wyatt. The U shape, of course, with Hopper. We saw that in the show. On and on I could go. But I write these names down beside the space structures to help myself remember and visualize in my mind paintings that I had seen by famous artists that have used these structures and how I might use these good bones in my paintings. That brings us to how I like to begin to paint. An idea must take form, so before I even put brush to paper, there are many sketches. And here are some of my sketchbooks. These sketchbooks, of course, are full of different ideas, different places I've been, different scenes I've seen, but I also fill them with notes. It's like a journal to me. When I go to an exhibit, I love to take a look at a painting, and then I write down the date, the artist's name, and a reference, so I can always come back and look at those as reference to use in my own paintings. Those of you who have been at the Hopper show know how many sketches he made of different things he saw. There were pictures he took, yes, with a camera, but he wasn't going to paint exactly from that picture. Instead, he used postcards and dreams and ideas and combined them all together to make the final painting. As artists studying the masters past and present, one should make notebooks full of doodles, which may or may not become finished work. For instance, here's a doodle by Picasso. And Picasso tells us, by forcing ourselves to use restricted means of many sketches, one finds a restraint on ideas and emotions. And of course, this liberates us to make invention in our painting. Like anything else in the world, art is a reflection of what's happening in society. It's true today and has always been true. And when we look at society, we may see where art is headed. Perhaps, perhaps not. But in the 80s, when I was first doing art shows, watercolors paint, they couldn't paint fast enough. There was lots of alla prima and plein air being done, and painters would sell their work before it was even dry as they sat at the art fair. People buying 2 and 3 framed or unframed pieces, and I remember all of us went to the bank. In the 90s, Fog, which was my company at that time of handmade paper sculpture, we went into production. That was where people who used to be hobbyists became painters and became professionals. They began selling G-clays and multiples, and sometimes they would sell them to Target or Home Goods. I remember many of my friends used prints in many of the motels and hotels, and again, we're going to the bank. Art became a real industry in the 90s, and millionaires gobbled up paintings and stored them, not for appreciation, but hoping they would be worth a lot of money. By 2000, workshops flourished, and everybody wanted to become an artist. Learn the latest techniques and tricks. Take a workshop. Oh, I remember I took several. Painters outgrew their market. Actually, I can remember one of my students said to me, "Oh, I don't have to come to your workshops anymore. I can just paint from YouTube." So the quality ceased, and ability was judged by how many likes you got on Facebook. How many of us have ever walked through an art show and looked at copies of finer artists on the walls? Now we're in a pandemic, and I hope that this has brought us back to self-style and individuality. It would be presumptuous of me for this austere group to demonstrate, as you all know, all my techniques of wet on wet and negative painting and wash painting or painting on UPO or painting on gold. But I want to show you some of these things because I think that might be interesting to you. In fact, I'll show you some of the origins of the painting that was in the recent WSI show. My painting was called What Lies Beneath, and it was the crab. When I began to make that crab painting, I did a lot of sketches of crabs, and I put them on vellum so that I could transfer them to watercolor paper as I worked through it. Here are two different examples of the crabs on vellum, and you can see how I've used them to transfer them. Then after transferring them to watercolor paper, I began to experiment with colors and painting of the crabs and backgrounds and seeing what I really like. Sometimes I did a great deal of detail in them. One of the things that I thought was kind of fun to do, I tried different backgrounds. For instance, using bubble wrap here in a wet on wet and then putting the crab into the scene. Or here using plastic wrap to get the feeling of separations and sea-like. And I kept doing those over and over until I was feeling proficient with the crab and doing different colorways. Important to have a feeling of what colors I really wanted to use on my crab or how I really wanted him to work in a final painting that I was going to do. Sometimes I like to paint on gold gesso. Gold gesso you can get from Blix, and it is painted on your 140 Arches watercolor paper, but it makes a really old Renaissance-like feel to the painting when you work with it. Here's the painting of a crab I did on that gold gessoed piece. And my final crab, which was in the WSI watercolor show, was done on gold gesso. Also, another medium that is fun to do is to do a painting on UPO. And this is a UPO painting which shows you a variety of what you can get with the crab painting. And of course, I want to do the crab in my values of black, white, and of course a medium gray to find out just what I want to be lightest and what I want to be darkest. But I think these are pretty much techniques that all of you are very familiar with. Of course, the paper or the materials I work with may be of interest to you, and you all, I'm sure, have your own special pieces. Stop a minute. I like to work on 140-pound arches. As a paper maker, I'm very particular about my papers, and so I am aware of different forms of papers that are put out by manufacturers that are perhaps too soft, carry too much starch in them or resist in them. But my favorite is arches, 140 or 300 pound. And you'll notice that most of my sketches were done on that 140 pound watercolor paper. Often I do them on the back of other paintings. For instance, I'm one of those people that loves to use both sides of every painting. So you will see that I don't want to waste paper in any way. The brushes I choose would be, I use a large flat, of course, a 2.5-inch flat, and an inch flat I like very much. And then the others are Lowell Cornell, and I have a 14, a 12, and a 6. And that pretty much makes my favorite brushes. But as you'll notice, I have a whole container of brushes that periodically I will make myself work with just to get a different effect, to remind myself of what they may do and how they're used. You know, all of us have so many wonderful brushes that we've gotten over the years. People have given them to us, or we have, of course, purchased them. You always have to have just the right brush if you take a workshop. And then we forget about them. We don't use them. we go back to just our favorite brushes again. So it's very important to keep those handy for you, so you grab the wrong one every once in a while. You grab the lizard lick and discover that it was kind of fun to have that point on it and have it carry a lot of water with it. Of course, because it's watercolor, I like to work from a large container of water. Often I see watercolorists working from a little cup of water, and I think, no, 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 no. Use a lot of water. It is called watercolor. And then I keep my squirt bottle very handy. The paints I like to use, you will see several colors here, and they're all transparent. I like to keep my transparent colors in a small container, different from, of course, the whole box of colors I have here. Many colors of watercolors that I've been given over the years. Some of them I use, some of them I don't. But it's wonderful to have this treasure trove. And as I said, I like to keep my transparent colors in a small container. This container can be gotten for $3 from Cheap Joe's, and it is a really easy watercolor container to take with me if I do plein air or wherever I go. Mainly when I teach workshops, I only ask my students to work from lemon yellow, permanent rose, and cobalt blue. Here you'll notice I have several other colors, but I think those are the important ones for an artist to work with. The three primary colors, of course, can make any color in the world. And often when you begin teaching students or beginning watercolors, it's important for them to go back to the primaries so they don't get carried away with the beautiful title of Cascade Green or has quinacridone gold to it that make them want to work with those things versus learning to make those colors on their own. I use, of course, just a little plastic tray to mix my colors in and mix them, and I always keep a sheet of a scrap piece of 140 handy so that I can test my colors before I put them to paper. So during the pandemic, in my studio I find piles of paintings, either on the wall or on the floor or stuck hither and yon. I know all of you have piles of paintings too. And one of the things I thought about, let's look at some of these paintings, maybe some of them from 6 years ago, and let's talk about some good bones on those paintings. So I took some of those paintings, and here was the original, and I cut it apart. I moved the pieces around for what I considered a better composition. Now, I can either glue these pieces down and paint again with gouache on gold gesso, or I can redraw the painting, redrawing the figures and then painting again, doing it over. I haven't decided what I'm going to do, but I do like the composition much more the way I have it now. So here is the finished painting done on gold gesso again, and I'm much more pleased with the outcome than I was with the original. There's no doubt about it. I love watercolor for it gives one such humility. Each day is a new, wonderful surprise. Even old paintings come alive, reviving basics and making changes. There could be no happier moments than when you know a painting is saying, "This is me."